Welcome to Good News, Bad News, the Libertarian Christian Roundtable, where every other week we challenge the status quo and give you the libertarian Christian analysis of what's happening in your world.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the meta news and a few other things. And we're also, just so you know, launching this as a podcast. So if you have watched this on YouTube before, but you'd also rather just hear us instead of watch us laugh and giggle at each other, you can subscribe to the Good News, Bad News podcast on all of your podcast apps. Or, of course, you can continue watching us here on YouTube. So you can subscribe at your whatever favorite podcast app you want, or if you need to, libertarianchristians.com/roundtable.
And we'd really appreciate it, by the way, if you also gave a like to this video, or if you gave a little 5-star review on whatever your favorite podcast app is. That'd be really helpful to us as we're trying to grow this thing.
Don't forget
to subscribe, rate, review.
Subscribe, review.
Comment.
Should be our mantra.
Blah, blah, blah.
End of every show, right? Yeah. And of course, buy Faith Seeking Freedom, because we're peddling that as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us. And if you're listening to this for the first time on a podcast, because we're going to promote this on our regular podcast, and maybe this is the first time, we actually have a whole year's worth, about every other week, of videos that deal with the news. Now, obviously, that's time limited in a sense, but you will get a taste of how we analyze the news and present things that have been going on over the past year, which of course in 2020, 2021 is really interesting and worth hearing. So you can go back on our YouTube channel, and again, if you don't know what to look up or whatever, just go to libertarianchristians.com. You can find everything there. So we want to do a quick intro for everybody, so we don't want to assume that new listeners have been listening or watching for a while. And so I am Doug Stewart. I'm the CEO of the Libertarian Christian Institute, the host of the Libertarian Christian podcast, and of course the sort of host here today, although I'll participate as well. So Norm, you're next.
Yeah, Norman Horn. I'm the founder and president of LCI. Been here a while, folks, and it's good we're starting up this kind of secondary podcast, and it's exciting to kind of keep expanding. And glad to have you guys on board and listening. Aaron, tell us about yourself, you weirdo.
That is the most awesome introduction I have ever gotten. Thank you very much, Norman. My name is Aaron Sepulveda. If you guys want to know my last name is Sepulveda Cue. I am an economist and I work for the Libertarian Christian Institute also, and I'm very happy to be with you guys.
Carrie.
I'm Carrie Baldwin. I'm a contributor at LCI, and I also have my own website called mirrorliberty.com.
What do you do at mirrorliberty.com? What can people sign up for?
Oh,
you have to let them know.
I do, I guess. Yeah. So, I do a few things, but the thing that you can actually sign up for are my Liberty seminars. I teach online courses in critical thinking, and I use the Socratic method to do that. And we have fun dialogues about the principles of a free society. And so kids, middle school, high school, and then also adults have the opportunity to learn and refine their critical thinking skills by having Socratic dialogues about the principles of free society.
Excellent. So you can check her out at mirrorliberty.com. So as we are wont to do in every episode, we discuss the news. And for this episode, we're going to discuss one particular piece of news, which is relatively new, which I guess that's why
it's as I would hope it should be.
It does fulfill the purpose of this, podcast.
Right. Well, it's not like what I mean is not like it's like last week's news. Just we finally are now just getting around to recording. This is more like it actually happened since we scheduled this meeting, which is China is apparently at war with your wallet or something. Aaron has the news item, like he can describe what's actually going on here.
Okay, so the quick way to see this is the Chinese after 2008, they had to rely more on their own central bank than on the Fed. Long story short, right? So then again, they started playing with interest rates. Oddly enough, real estate, which is very sensitive to interest rates, had a boom, and now it's having its bust. So the most important company, real estate company of China, Evergrande Group, which is not only real estate, but it's mainly real estate, owes about $300 billion to international investors, and all of their investments in real estate are collapsing. And therefore, because the Chinese system now, that for some strange reason people are obsessed saying that is the best system in the world, it's really just built on cheap credit. And there's a bunch of, not just, you're not talking just about real estate development, you're talking about entire cities that are useless, what Hayek would call malinvestments, which Doc Stewart thought about giving it a specific name.
Oh yeah, like in China, it's called a Mao investment.
Exactly. And they it's not like there were cities and then people left and then you have like ghost towns. No, they built ghost towns, and that's the way they stayed, because nobody could actually move because you have malinvestments.
Did they do it like Hollywood style, where they just put up a facade just so that you could like roll the camera in front of it?
This is even
like,
worse.
Did they save money? Did they save money? Like cardboard or
this is even worse. They actually built like entire towns and nobody moved in. And now that for sure is collapsing because a lot of investors are looking at the assets now. They're not coming out. A lot of development they did is not working out. This group is so big, and we tend to make jokes about it, that they even have soccer teams that bring international players to China, completely unknown or semi-unknown players, and pay them $20 million and above. As if they were Messi or Ronaldo. They're just almost completely unknown.
So these ghost cities have soccer teams that have rosters.
No. That's a good one. It's one of the I wouldn't doubt that one of the ghost cities will actually have a soccer team, but for sure, usually the big cities have the soccer team. But these groups, this investment group, like Evergrande Group, does have its own soccer team, and the level of investment is just completely insane. It's completely outside of the ordinary.
Okay. I have questions. I have questions about this, man. So you're gonna have to help me here. All right. So number one, I think it's kind of an interesting thing to note that it's like, apparently it doesn't really matter if you're supposedly capitalistic or communistic. If you're running a central bank, it's going to fail because they're going to end up having these business cycles because you're manipulating interest rates. So kind of an Austrian point right there. That's interesting. That there is no specific tie to whether a central bank is somehow inherently, that's of the capitalist regime versus not. I mean, this happened in both cases, and both are having business cycle.
It doesn't matter if they pretend to serve the free market or not.
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting to note. Secondarily, I think it's of course notable to kind of realize that this can't happen when you have something like Bitcoin or a hard currency in general. So that's kind of a meta point as well. But okay, but more on to this like there's really interesting implications here as to what could theoretically happen in China as a result of this. We actually saw almost variants on that Ghost City thing happening even in the United States, in the lead up to the 2008 real estate crash in the United States, right? I mean, a lot of houses being built in the middle of nowhere that were commanding ridiculous prices. They'd be bought on no credit whatsoever, and then those. I mean, we've heard of these even large high rises and whatnot that were built in the middle of nowhere. You like virtual ghost apartment complexes in various places in the United States. These do exist. You can find them. But what I'm curious about is like, okay, well, what happens now to these sorts of things now that Evergrande could theoretically go bankrupt? So how does that happen in China? I mean, are we just going to see a similar type of bailout effect and then a devaluation of their currency as a result? Or are we going to see them actually go under and then the assets get sold off?
That is exactly the big question, because the Chinese government has never faced something like this. And what I want the listeners to understand, you would think, okay, didn't they learn already from the crisis of 2008 from Americans?
Yeah, but that's like asking if America learned from the Great Depression or the 1913 edition, whatever.
Not just that. From Japan in the 90s had exactly the same real estate crisis we had in 2008. Japan had it, and it's very similar to what's happening now in China. For some complicated reasons, they had to actually expand real estate industries, let's say in the 90s in Japan for some international pressures. You had the boom, the bust, and then the recovery. They become zombified economies. Japan first, then the United States, and now China looking forward. So what the big picture of this is, the prediction is that they're going to become zombified, which means a lot of companies that really don't produce stuff that are all that useful, they're going to be kept alive just by all the refinancing that their central bank allows, which is what has been happening in Japan since
so this is why they also call Japanification here.
Yep, it every time an economy zombifies, which means a bunch of companies that you kind of know they should not exist, but for some reason they exist, that they're just being refinanced directly or indirectly from the central bank. And that's why the central bank is so problematic, because it destroys the idea of innovation, of innovation from Schumpeter. It just does not allow it. Stops it.
Now, when you read this as well, it also seems interesting that this is coinciding with the beginnings of electronic shortages, which is happening because of supply line disruption in China. It's not just because of the pandemic and things like that. It's because of this type of stuff too. Because in the same way that we have overinvestment and malinvestment in real estate in the United States, and we had the corresponding, kind of crash as a result, we should have been investing elsewhere. And likewise, you could say that this is endemic of not investing in the right way and allowing the market to work. Because
too much investment in real estate pushes resources away from the supply chains of every other industry, which in this case, because it's China, it affects the entire world. And to be fair with how the world works, if China messes up, affects everybody. And some people will say we shouldn't deal with China. Okay, but then that means that whenever we Americans, I don't know if people know that, when we mess up, everyone gets hurt in the world. So this is not something just particular of China. So this is the two biggest economies in the world. The next one could be, remember when Europe has its crisis in 2010, 2011 with Greece, everyone was freaking out. Why? Because it's such a big economy that it does affect the supply chains all throughout the world, because it affects the credit and the proper allocation of that credit.
So I want to point out something that Norm mentioned. This isn't just about COVID. I think it's very easy for people to look at this on the surface and just be like, as far as the chronological order of things is such that this must be, a result of the lockdowns for COVID or whatever. But this is sort of a long time coming sort of thing, right? This is something that is endemic in a central banking sort of system. And so we can't just say, this is because of COVID, so we can ignore it.
The Economist magazine has been talking about this since, if I remember correctly, 2012, 2013, because they're a little like one ghost city here, another ghost city over there, and then you start piling up, and guess what?
Did the Chinese government, I mean, I didn't even know about these ghost cities. So did the Chinese government ever use these cities to kind of like show off how wonderful it is? Because I know they do that. But I just kind of wonder how much that played into their overall narrative and what they're saying about it now. Like, how do they explain it away?
I know they show off usually the nice areas of the existing big cities, for sure.
Yeah,
they
tend to want to tout Shenzhen, Shanghai, and so on, in Beijing, because those are kind of their like crown jewel things and so on. Especially Shenzhen, because you can look at that and just look at the picture. Like, I mean, for anybody who hasn't really seen, it is stunning. And frankly, it is a gorgeous transformation to see what Shenzhen looked like in the 80s versus the 90s versus the 2000s versus now. It's an incredible transformation. And that's not to laud communism at all. It's like that is more like what capitalism does, realistically. Is that it is when you're allowed to make those types of decisions for yourselves, well, suddenly amazing prosperity can happen. And to be sure, one of the we should rail against communism as much as we possibly can with respect to the way in which the CCP works and everything, but we cannot discount the fact that it is actually it's capitalism and free trade that has been able to make China at least as good as it is. And then in particular, the Chinese people. We can't just, identify communism as like, that is the Chinese thing or whatever, because it isn't. And that's not fair to them. I have way too many, for one thing, we do way too much business with China to just write it off as like, oh, well, they're just commies and blah. No, that'd be wrong. It's disrespectful of these great people that are over there. And great companies for that matter.
Well,
sorry, let me just conclude that thought. And just in the same way that we should, decry, American companies and that are tools of the state in this regard, and participating in, the awfulness that is American aggression and so on, while we can simultaneously praise good groups that are doing the right thing and just being good businesses. That's a great thing. So.
Yeah, well, it's my understanding that the Communist Party in China just, learned some really hard lessons and figured out that they can't actually have any measure of communism without capitalism financing it. And so they've permitted capitalism to breathe in certain areas or in certain ways.
Even the USSR did that too, and eventually they failed. Of course.
No, if I may interject on this one, the typical name we provide for this, and please start using this name for all of our listeners, is called mercantilism. We already have it, and Adam Smith specifically wrote The Wealth of Nations specifically to contradict it. Just to give you guys a point of reference, this is not uncommon at all, just so everybody knows. The one from the 70s, they had the Cultural Revolution, if I'm correct, in China, and it was a mess.
60s and 70s, yes.
60s and 70s, to rebuild the economy of China. Then Xiaoping, if I'm correct, led the reform, privatized a lot of things. And this is a trick so that people understand outside the United States how it works. It's not uncommon outside the United States to have one party rule. And the rule is, okay, you can be a billionaire, you can have your businesses, but don't badmouth the monopolistic political party, whichever political party you can have. Saddam Hussein used to have that kind of system, and a bunch of other places are like that. Yeah. So it's just that China had a lot of resources because it's so big. But this is very common. What they do is, okay, this idea of socialism didn't work. Maybe we'll keep one or two industries. Usually oil tends to be a big thing to keep it nationalized, but the rest they privatize. But the rule is you can do it, but don't badmouth the monopoly political party, which it doesn't have to be communist. You can have every conceivable name that you can imagine. It's not uncommon.
Yeah, case in point there is Jack Ma and Alibaba, which is happening. I mean, that's another thing that's happening right now is that, Jack Ma's company is getting broken up because he just had just enough pushback against the narrative of the state to kind of get them involved, and they're cracking.
So this brings us inevitably to the question for our listeners, for us in America as libertarian Christians: what do we do about this information? Like, what is the takeaway for managing our finances? Because obviously we can't control the Communist Party in China. If you believe voting does anything, you can't even contribute to that. We have now. I feel a little more depressed because I'm like, wait, we only had the Fed first. Now we got to worry about the Chinese central bank, and it's like, well, it's clearly creating problems, and it's been potentially foreseeable for several years. What do we do now? And I realize that one of the answers is going to be from you guys is, crypto, which is true. But like, what? And we could delve into that, of course, and I'm on board with that. But we also want to know, like, well, what's the practical What's the practical application here?
Well, if I may, I mean, it seems to me like the reason why these central banks, whether it's the Fed or the Chinese central bank, is experiencing this, is because the market still works. Like even when they're intervening, the market rules still function. And so it seems like on an individual level, as far as it is within your power to do so, you should operate by those, by these economic principles, these free market principles, because at the very least, you'll be more prepared when things happen, when things fall apart. But I don't know. That's how I take it.
Norm, what should we think about the Chinese people? You kind of mentioned this earlier, and I know that there's a lot of sort of anti-China sentiment, especially from our friends on the right who supported Trump, and that was a big deal. And honestly, I mean, anybody who has a very basic understanding, and by basic I mean like not a whole lot of understanding about the world economies, and I mean to some extent I might even put myself in there. I don't know what the heck is going on with Chinese currencies and like all that kind of stuff. It's like I don't know what to think, and so it's very easy to sort of be like, oh my goodness, China's just a problem. Like it just sort of like lump it under China is a problem. But I want you to say more about what you were saying earlier about the good people in China doing good work.
I love my Chinese colleagues, and I've worked with people off and on from China in various ways for 20 years or more, probably at this point. And from students who I got to know as an undergrad, and TAs through as an undergrad through grad school, and now part of my company does do manufacturing in China. And so I've had a lot of interactions with Chinese people, and I think it's just really wrong to try and paint China with some type of brush that is only and always red. I would rather that we kind of think like individualists, like the way that we say that we want to be treated, and so to not demonize to demonize the people in particular. Let's criticize communism.
But if you think about it, having the largest population does mean that the regular citizens have the least amount of influence, and therefore are completely not at fault of anything that happens in China, because it's just so big under a lot of power from one central political party.
So it's not like Europeans can look at Americans and say, well, you voted for the guy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. Like, would you like for people in France or Germany or the UK to look at something that Trump did or something that Biden did and then just blame you for it? Like, you voted for him, like you said. Like, we wouldn't approve of that. We don't think that that's right.
Yeah, right.
We would like to be treated like individuals. Okay, give the Chinese people the same benefit. Are they not humans? Am I not a man?
But by the way, just a good example is I'm in contact with people from Venezuela.
Yeah.
And they're literally the opposite of Maduro. Like everyone that I know from Venezuela, except one. Okay, that's one. That's one.
Okay, just for one.
They're literally the most critical people against Maduro's regime.
Yeah.
So the citizenship and the governments, almost by nature, if you think about the theory of the elites, they have to be very different. They have to, like, by necessity. And the American elites by necessity have to be different than regular Americans. The Chinese elites have to be very different, almost by nature.
Yeah. And I guess that's sort of the meta point here that that I would want to get across, and maybe that's somewhat askew from the original point about the financial markets themselves and what we can kind of learn from that. I mean, at least at the very least, let's just not give in to the temptation to scapegoat China as being the source of all problems that are up and coming in this world, because that is that's a terrible thing, I think, to do overall. I would not want that to be the way in which we interact with continuing on with China. So from an economic level, of course, crypto, woo, yeah, and so on. But also just recognizing that, like, the Austrian theory that explains a lot of this stuff, like, it continues to show accuracy in explaining how this stuff works. So that's a heartening thing. And to be able to educate oneself and be able to continue to explain to other people who don't understand what's going on as well, what's happening, is a value. So, that'd be another takeaway I could kind of get from it.
Yeah. Well, you talked about, having a meta point here, and I think let's even pull back even further and just analyze the news a little bit here and have that discussion that we were sort of talking about before we went on air. It's like, what I personally like, I open up like Drudge Report or any news aggregator, and I just read these headlines. I'm just like, this is depressing. Like, like I said earlier, we have to worry about a Chinese central bank too. Oh, we now have to deal with this. And now, in some news, it's like, okay, well, that's bad news, but that's like kind of an unrelated thing happening to like Justin Trudeau or, some person in France or whatever. And it's like, well, okay, that doesn't really affect me, but like, goodness, things look dire. And you have vaccine mandates being, potentially enforced by OSHA. You have cities around the world implementing vaccine passports. And like, Carrie, you had this question of like, well, is tyranny inevitable and we have to fight it, or can we prevent it from happening in the first place? Maybe that's not exactly how you worded it, but there's this little bit of like, well, man, maybe we just need to keep fighting tyranny rather than try to prevent it.
Yeah, I part of this question came up for me just sort of thinking about, well, like there have been a lot of comparisons to Nazi Germany and that level of totalitarianism. And I think previously in history, we've had nation states who compete against one another. Like there was a motivation for the United States government to go to war with Germany, right? There was a motivation for them to actually like send a military, but we're in a different situation now because there's a global tyranny sort of happening, and so there's no nation that's going to swoop in and save the day and we get to have some benefit from. And so but we also ask this question, like, how did the Germans allow Hitler to do what he did? And although there are a number of answers to that question, ultimately at the heart of that question is, how do we prevent it, or can we prevent it? And so I'm just wondering, is a more meta question, as you say, is tyranny inevitable and something that we just have to live and fight through, that way? Or is it something that we can actually prevent? Like we can actually see, and red flags or whatever, and change course such that we don't have to go through that cycle again. So that's sort of my ultimate meta question.
Yeah. Well, and one little thing you said, well, noticing the red flags along the way, it's like, how do you know what's an actual red flag or just an anomaly to, if New York ends up being the only, let's say 5 big cities in the US are the only cities that ever do vaccine passports. And in 10 years, it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess that was just a blip in, something that could go on, then that'd be great. But if it's like a red flag as to how the entire world is going to be or whatever it might be, I'm only picking on vaccine passports because it's the first thing that came to mind.
Because it's obvious.
Whatever act of tyranny that happens on a small scale that could be pointing to a larger trend. Sometimes you don't know that it's a larger trend until much later. And I know that there are... I have friends who seem to be on the everything that looks like a red flag just must be the end of the world kind of attitude. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it seems like that from my vantage point. I don't know, Norm, Aaron, what do you have to add here? I'm going to just keep rambling with my thoughts and I'm going to have to wrap it up.
To me, like the couple things come to mind as you describe kind of the breadth and scope of the question, Carrie. Number one is that we have at least a way of talking about this phenomena, and that suggests some measure of strategy. And that comes back to actually, well, really some stuff that was going on in Great Britain I want to say, well, it's post World War II. And Eric, we were talking about this a little earlier with regards to this kind of the looming nationalism of various portions of the economy, and Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom partially in response to that. And then eventually there was a gentleman whose name escapes me at this exact moment, who founded a certain kind of, well, it was kind of the first think tank in Great Britain in order to try and shift the realm of public opinion in the direction more towards freedom. And he used this concept called the Overtone Window, which is this idea that there is a basket of kind of acceptable policies, and it's on a spectrum as to what people are willing to accept, in the spectrum being from liberty to tyranny in this regard. And so the job, if you will, of the totalitarian is to try and limit that breadth of acceptable policies to, thinner and thinner, and shift it more towards totalitarianism. It's the job of the liberty-loving person, however, to realize that can also be shifted the other direction. And so this is why think tanks exist in the first place, presumably, and this is why we have groups like the Mises Institute, the Cato Institute, Foundation for Economic Education, in order to try and educate people and but persuade them to see the wisdom of liberty ideas.
To move the Overtone window towards the good.
Yeah, so shifting that Overtone window towards the liberty zone and making it less and less possible for a tyrannical result to be acceptable. So this is where, popularizing things like what we're doing at the Libertarian Christian Institute is very important, in that, and especially given the context of what we're talking about with regards to, the Christian point of view in particular, to show that, yeah, sure, you can be a Christian and live in a communist country and hope, but there's Christians everywhere. Of course, there's probably more dedicated Christians in China now than there may be dedicated Christians in the United States, or so may be the case. It may be true. I'm not entirely sure. I've heard it before, but so that's entirely possible. But what we should also realize is that it is our Christian values that drive us toward promoting human liberty as well. And so so what we want to do is make that spectrum of possible ways to fall into Christian theology, kind of shift that in the liberty direction as well, is to show people that, no, this is the right way of thinking. It's over here. It's not over here. And so on. So I think it is definitely something that is preventable, in that the more that you can convince people of the wisdom of liberty overall, that the more likely you are to prevent those things from happening in the first place. Whether or not that there are certain things that are inevitable is not, I don't know. I don't really want to say, I am want to declare anything to be truly kind of fatalistic in this regard, because whenever it comes to accounting to human action, that has will involved. And as opposed to gravity or thermodynamics, where those things are, just immutable laws of nature, that is not the way humans work. And so I would say that nothing is truly inevitable. Yeah. And it does come down to choices.
Well, and I think it's interesting because, Doug had mentioned the headlines and how they're depressing. They're also simultaneously, some of them very ridiculous. Like there was the Jacobin article about how Hitler opposed vaccines too. So
he was definitely not against mandates, though.
Yeah.
Right. Anyways, it is striking to me that the message coming from the media, which I can only describe as propagandistic, is definitely tries to convey the message that tyranny is inevitable and you just need to suck it up and take it instead of resisting. So at any rate, that
Yeah, in their world, it's sort of like the march toward progress, and so it's like you just got to get on board, and they don't realize that it's not progress, or bits, or most of it, or the narrative itself isn't. So the narrative is meant to sort of keep you like, I better follow along here.
Right. I mean, we've heard it said before, like, wouldn't it be great if the state just said something and nobody cared?
Yeah, I mean, that's the Overtone Window direction we need to see.
Yeah, that's kind of where we want to head.
Yeah.
I mean, like, do we even, you kind of pose the question is, resistance isn't really all that necessary if nobody cares.
Yeah.
So resistance.
The typical example with Switzerland, that people don't even know the name of the prime minister or president or whatever. And that's a healthy society because they don't have to worry about it.
Yes. Isn't that great? Like, we used, like, 10 years ago, remember how, people would, 10 or 15 years ago, remember how people would talk about on the news, like, it's amazing how many people around here don't even know who their governor is or who their president is. And it's like, and they were doing this on, like, Jay Leno's show and doing what the man on the street talks and whatnot. And I look back on that now and I think, like, geez, I wish that were still the case.
Right.
But we are not. So in that respect, we are definitely devolving in this regard. But there are so many good things to be hopeful for and to be pleased about in terms of the way society is moving, that I think that, like, I don't see this as being. In fact, I would venture to say that it is in the interest of the state to try and promote the sky is falling view. So I would say that it is much better to be heartened by this and in a sense internally resist the spirit of defeat in this regard than to and look upon the world instead with a kind of attitude of hope in this way.
If you don't mind me, Norman, what I have discovered all throughout the time dealing mainly with media is there is a strong bias towards negative news.
Of course.
And social media has given lots of positive things, but it also has created everyone is in media now. I hope that makes sense. And so we have that bias of what we're looking at the negative stuff. Like, we have to do sometimes, what is it that most people are going to have concern? Not the great stories, the feel-good stories, but is the ones that are negative. So always keep in mind when you're reading the news is, okay, this is naturally biased. It's not a sample of reality. It's just the things that people are more concerned with today. And we should be concerned about, but that doesn't represent reality by necessity. Is just the marginal things that are of high concern, and the rest is much better.
Aaron, you got to make a meme. The news is not a sample of reality. That is great.
That's great.
Well, we used to talk about this is something that I've tried to be very, like, I'm pretty sure I've told you this, Doug, and I'm pretty sure I'm not sure I've told you this, Aaron. So a professor, a friend of mine, once said, the plural of anecdote is not data. Okay. And I am very careful, I think now. What?
Anecdata?
And no.
Anecdotal?
No.
That's going to be a new one we're using.
That's terrible, and I hate it already.
I only had one good joke for this episode.
But it was but the point is that if you're a scientist, you kind of know what that means. So for those listening, like, okay, an anecdote is anecdotal. It doesn't have a representation of what is actually happening for a phenomenon necessarily. And just because you have a couple of anecdotes doesn't suddenly mean you now have data, which is something that has a systematization to it.
Wouldn't we say that, unless I'm wrong, that news by necessity, they happen to be anecdotes, the most interesting anecdotes of the day, that's all.
In a sense, not even data. Well, there is a sense in which I guess the point is that you can't necessarily take just a news item and then just totally extrapolate to this is now the most important thing in the world. Nobody should care about anything else. And the sky is falling and all it is this. Like, okay, because that's what it's like. A good example is the way we often, like, we have a very innate sense of, like, we want to hear the personalized stories, right? And it's like a good example is even what's going on with COVID stuff. Like the data would suggest that, like, okay, actually, here's a really good example of that. Remember how a year ago it was like, do you know anybody who got COVID yet?
Mm-hmm.
No, not really. I haven't met any. I just hear about what's going on in New York or something like that. But then, and so for some reason it seemed more distant to us. But now, do you just almost certainly know somebody who's had it? You probably know somebody who's been hospitalized. You may know somebody who's died. I definitely know all of those. So, does it hit closer to home once that's happened? Now, that doesn't mean that you should go off and say, oh, the sky is falling and that the world is coming to an end. But that it's different. It feels different when you have kind of these personal stories that start integrating themselves into our own narrative at that point. Neither of those are data. To find out what is data, you have to take a step back. You have to get dispassionate about it. You need to take a different look at what's going on. So realize where you kind of sit in that spectrum of things.
Well, I know someone who's not dispassionate about data, and that's you, Norm. You get very passionate about data.
All about the data.
So we're gonna awkwardly segue to the final segment of our episode today, which is, what have you been consuming culturally other than the news? I will go first and say that it has to do with the now Emmy award winning big time show Ted Lasso.
Oh,
which Aaron, I don't know. I've told you about it. Have you been watching?
Some clips on
just
on YouTube.
Some clips. All right. So
you'll see why in a minute. You'll see why.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So Ted Lasso is just a fun story. It's on Apple TV Plus, which is pretty inexpensive to purchase, and it is about an American football coach goes to England and coaches soccer, and he has no idea what he's doing, and yet he has this confidence and maturity to him that is contagious.
The structure of regular soccer is different than American soccer. The structure,
yeah. So I mean, like, y'all have ties here is kind of a line. It's like, oh, he just keeps learning and learning and learning about it, but he just has this infectious smile and warm attitude, and there is a very and you might think, oh, well, is this just one of those like feel good shows that has no basis in reality? No, it is very much a heartwarming account of somebody who is a genuine human being, not like some fake person who's just like all smiles. Like, I could think of all kinds of TV preachers that seem like that, without naming names. But that's what I've been consuming, and it's near the end of the second season, and there will be a third season. I don't know how many more.
It has a Christian quote, by the way.
Oh,
remember that one? It says, "In American sports, ties only happen in the Book of Revelation, if it happens at all." Because it never happens ties. Yeah, in the United States does happen. That's why. Super weird.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. There's a lot of cultural references in the show too, which is really funny because he'll say like these lines and they'll be like dad jokes, sort of, in a way, or they'll just be actual jokes that he just throws into conversations, and so it's just got this charm to it. It is not a family friendly show. I will warn listeners, readers, watchers, whatever. Guess you're not reading this episode.
Okay.
Norm, how about you?
Let's go back to China. I've been reading a series of novels recently that I've really been enjoying. Science fiction by a gentleman named, and I hate to probably mispronounce the name yet again, as like Xie Liu. Wrote this series called The Three Body Problem. It's freaking great, and it's like it's actually begins the story in the Cultural Revolution, and tells kind of the stories of the struggle sessions that happened, and the murder of scientists at the time at the hands of what you might call the ideologues, or the communist takeover at the time, and of the Cultural Revolution. And it's a fascinating novel. It spans it's gargantuan in scope, in a sense, in that it takes place. I mean, it's essentially like, I guess the short version is that it's essentially about an alien invasion that's going to take place, and it is known that it is going to take place in about 450 to 500 years from present day. And so the process by which they are trying to resist, in a sense, it's bizarre and imaginative and just fascinating. There's a lot of hardcore science in it, as well as some kind of extrapolated stuff. It's very unusual in that, we're not really used to the way, as Americans at least, to the way in which kind of dialogue will occur between Chinese people who are within kind of their own hierarchical structures at times. And so you kind of have to get used to what's going on in that respect. But I find it fascinating. It's great. It's really great, well-written stuff. The translation is terrific. It won, though it's called the Galaxy Nebula Award or something. It was an award-winning novel series. And I'm in book 2 called The Dark Forest right now. Loving it. Highly recommend it. Netflix is supposed to come out with a series at some point in the next year and a half. Okay. I don't know how they're going to do it, because it sounds like, I just don't know how you would make this into a TV series. And I love when you kind of discover books like that, because it just it just feels so different than like you're just watching another movie in your brain or something. But you want something that's like really thought provoking. You don't do that very well, and often in American novels.
All right, Aaron, how about you, man? Other than Ted Lasso clips, what have you been consuming?
Okay, so it's still related to politics. So I listen to this, like I overconsume Tim Dillon, Michael Malice, and the Babylon Bee podcast and articles. Those ones are for sure every single day, at every single moment of the day. My childhood friends were we used to play American football. Yes, where I grew up, we used to play American football. So we have a fantasy NFL fantasy team, and it was predicted that I was gonna lose every single game, and I have won every single game so far. So nice. I am super happy.
Dallas wasn't on your list.
Okay, that's the next topic. Okay. It's coming. Okay, you guys will find out that I find hilarious that the only fans in the NFL that celebrate a season of one loss and one win are the Dallas Cowboys fans. I still cannot understand how could that happen, but that's how it is. So there you go. That's my last cultural comment, if you wish. I find it amazing that there can be fan base like that. Okay.
All right, Carrie, other than Jacobin Magazine, have you been reading any fiction?
No. Well, I have to say, I have been quite jaded by, recent attempts by Hollywood to tell a story, because I think they've completely lost the concept of storytelling. So at any rate, my kids and I actually watched a movie that was done from 2011 called Hugo. I'm just going to read the description here. It's an American adventure drama film directed and produced by Martin Scorsese and adapted for the screen by John Logan. It's based on the Brian Selznick 2007 book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. It tells the story of a boy who lives alone in a railway station in Paris in the 1930s, only to become embroiled in a mystery surrounding his late father's automaton and the pioneering filmmaker, I'm going to mess up his name, Georges Méliès. He's a French guy, but so that guy is real. And so they actually have a lot of historical explanation about the origins of filmmaking and things like that. So it is both entertaining and historically interesting, and the kids really enjoyed it. And it was a nice break from all of the fiction that is out there today.
Madness.
Well, that's enough madness and fiction that we have time for. We are going to wrap up this episode. For those of you just tuning in on this first inaugural audio version as well, or something like that. I don't know how to word that properly on the fly. These episodes are actually typically a little shorter, and we do jump into specific news items, and we hope you will come enjoy them with us. Oh my goodness, I just realized I forgot. You can send us email, and if you want to ask us questions, we will feature your questions if they're appropriate and if we can answer them. And if we can't, we'll just
we'll try to clean it up if necessary. But
yeah,
we'll try
right.
it.
Roundtable at libertarianchristians.com. Send us your emails, and we will do our best to answer them on the next show, which is about every other week. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.